Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, those that are here in person and those that are here online. We welcome you to our fourth installment of the Brown Bag Summer Series, hosted by the Department of Psychiatry, the Office of DICE. And I have a few housekeeping things to cover before I introduce our guest. So just to remind everyone, we will have an attendance sheet that is being passed around for those that are here in person. We ask that you sign your first and last name. And the QR code reminder does pop up 10 to 15 minutes before the end of the presentation. And if you wouldn't mind either taking a screenshot, or we do have it on the doors as well. So feel free to help yourself to the evaluation that way. And we also will have our Q&A session. We'll have a few different Q&A things happening today, but the Q&A, for any of them, we ask that if you raise your hand and wait until a microphone is brought over to you, then we will be able to have one of our folks bring the microphone so that the question can be heard online as well. Today we have with us two members of CCSI and someone who most of us know, Shane Wiegand, and you've probably seen him at some point around Rochester or here at the University of Rochester. I like to proudly call him a friend, and I'm glad that he is here today to share his updated presentation with us. We'll let him and Tay Porter-Jourdain introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about themselves as they jump into their presentation. So please join me with a warm round of applause for our guests.
Right. Works? No, it doesn't. Hold on. Now it works. Hello, everyone. I'm Shane Wiegand. I came here in 2018 for a brown bag presentation as a fourth grade teacher from Rush Henrietta. I was trying to answer a question that my students had asked me that really stumped me. That was, had Martin Luther King Jr. ever come to Rochester, or had we had a civil rights movement? My students and I met with elders in the community. We looked through old documents and deed records, and we learned this story that we shared with many of you about our local history of redlining, racially restrictive covenants, and the thousands of everyday folks in Rochester that participated in a civil rights movement here in Rochester, as well as at the University of Rochester Medical Center. Since then, we've been incredibly busy. You can see our team has grown significantly. We work with 20 local school districts here in Monroe County and several hundred across New York State, helping kids, teachers, and students learn and own their local history of civil rights and decide what it means for them and their community. Our hope today is to not do a rehashing of the story of redlining in our community. If you haven't heard that story, I recommend you watch our grand rounds from 2021 or 2018 and learn a little bit more about some of those stories. But today we're going to take a look at what kind of came next. Similar to today, in 1968, there was a huge moment in Rochester's history where county and city and suburban governments came together in a huge push for racial justice that was just incredibly a failure. We're going to take a look a little bit at that story and think about what lessons does that learn for us today at U of R and in our community to help us reckon with the racism of our past, understand our history, and create a safer, more inclusive URMC and larger community. And I'm delighted to have our brand new team member, amazing educator here in Rochester, Tay Porter-Jourdain, joining me with this presentation and inquiry.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Tay Porter-Jourdain. I have formerly served as an educator, an instructional leader, and DEI facilitator within the city of Rochester. I am Rochester born and raised, so I've always felt a commitment to my community and just a fulfillment from working within that community and ensuring that kids are getting the education that they are deserving of. I left the classroom after I learned about this project just because I myself really wanted to learn more about the true and rich history of our community and then have a widespread impact by sharing that information with community members such as yourselves. I'm very honored to be here with Shane today, and thank you all for showing up today.
And for those on Zoom, we'll be inviting you to use the Q&A feature to share questions, notices, and wonders and feedback. The way we're going to do everything today is going to be through inquiry, where we share sources. We invite you to think and to talk and explore and really try to answer the questions that we're going to raise today. One last thing I want to mention, our work at Our Local History is in schools in grades 2 through 12, from Black and Puerto Rican civil rights to our local LGBTQ civil rights movement. And we do these workshops at universities. We'd love to come to your department and dive into deeper into any of these topics. Our work is not just for kids, just like today, it's very much for our whole community.
So as we work together today, we have some questions that we'd like you to keep in the back of your mind as we go through the session. How has racism impacted Greater Rochester? How have people responded and resisted? How does this history inform my work at URMC and my participation in my community? And what lessons can we learn from past equity efforts in Greater Rochester?
One thing to note, my hope is that in learning some of our local history and our local story, that many of you in this room will be inspired in the same way that a high school senior recently was here in Rochester, a senior named Benita Corrala, who advocated in her town, at her town board meeting, for racial justice in her community, in the same vein of learning from the people who have gone before her. How do we carry on that legacy? How do we not make the same mistakes? And by the end, I hope we'll all be a little more like Benita. We'll finish her story as we close, though.
So to help us have this conversation and inquiry today, we just have some group norms that we invite you to consider. So the first is to speak our truths. So we really want to validate everyone's experience here, but just know that your experience might not be the same as the person who's next to you. So we ask you to practice using I statements. The next is to stay engaged and acknowledge that we may experience discomfort, right? This is sometimes a difficult conversation to have. And it makes me think about this quote from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Again, it can be difficult to talk about race and inequity, but we really need to have that positive friction if we really want to see change in the community. Acknowledge intent and own impact.
And I think to really do that well, we have to think about who we are. We have to be willing to ask for feedback. We have to be willing to sidestep defensiveness and lean into curiosity. Some of you might have noticed I'm a white person who does work around racial equity in our community. With good intentions, I have caused harm. I have said the wrong thing. And many times when people have let me know that, I've reacted with defensiveness. I've said things like, I'm an elementary school teacher. Of course I don't mean that. Like, I didn't mean it like that, or you're misunderstanding me. What if we just took a deep breath in those moments and instead said something like, gratitude. Thank you for telling me that. I really need to think about it. Can you help me understand maybe what I'm missing? I want to be safe today that if something doesn't make sense or frustrates, that we ask for clarity, to say something like, I'm a little uncomfortable with what you said. Could you explain? And then as we're sharing or asking questions, just the statement of, hey, this is a first draft. Could I have permission to speak a first draft? I want your feedback. I'm going to be honest, these worked great in my 4th grade classroom, but they've worked excellently with real estate agents, judges, police officers, and medical professionals like yourselves.
The next norm is to accept and expect non-closure. We only have a short amount of time together today, so this will take continuous learning and practice. And then finally, respect where others are in their journeys. We're really hoping to keep a safe and productive space today, so just make sure that you are leaning into one another.
Everyone good with these norms? Thank you so much. We will dive in.
All right, so to get our brains warmed up, we're gonna do something called a zoom in, zoom out. So we have some data that we're going to show you, and we've purposefully taken away key information, and we really want to just get you talking about the info that you see. What do you wonder? What do you notice? What can you infer? And if you're joining us virtually, you're just going to put this into the Q&A. And if you're here in person, we're asking if you could talk to a neighbor, someone next to you, behind you. And if you're far away, you can just keep it to yourself, but we're going to
find a neighbor.
Yeah, or find a neighbor, join someone if you want to get comfy with them. But what do you wonder? What do you notice? And what can you infer?
So we're going to go quick. We're going to give you just a little bit on each slide and force you to look closer at something than you would if we just showed you the whole thing. You ready? Also, we're teachers. We want to get your brains moving. Yeah. So here we go.
All right, talk to your neighbor and in the Q&A.
What do you notice? What do you wonder? Yep. No, that's good. And we want you to be comfortable with not knowing. That's okay. Lean into it and be curious.
I see people wondering, what is this a graph of? Is it about engagement in the government? You want to know what data are they looking at specifically? They're noticing a decrease. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Let me bring this over. You see someone ask, what is the disparity about? What exactly are we looking at?
Give you a little bit more information.
A little bit more. Keep talking. What do you notice? A large discrepancy between these two lines. Is this good or is this bad?
Is it golf or basketball?
You never know. All right, you think they're ready for a little more?
A little more? Oh, didn't go. There we go. Oh, no. Sorry.
Far,
a little
far.
more. No one saw that.
What could this be? I see someone saying this might be household income between two different populations. What is high deprivation?
It's a good question.
And does you think they're ready for the last little bit?
And I see people noticing it's Finger Lakes region, so our community.
All right, here's the last little bit. Keep talking to your neighbor. When do you think this is from? What year might this be from? And if you're in person, feel free to call it out.
And what narratives might it challenge for you? What other questions might it raise?
Someone said 2022.
22, maybe?
Now, yep, we haven't agreed with that. 2020. Any other guesses? All right, I think we can reveal it. Let's see who's getting some bragging rights. This is from 2017. So with those same neighbors, or in a personal reflection, what story does this tell you? Or what questions does it raise for you when you see this and know that this is from 2017?
And Brian online is going to pop in the chat a link to some graphs that we hope on your own you'll dig into that complicate and add to some of this data. But one of the things we really want to highlight is how neighborhood location, where people live, and income can make a huge difference, but not all of the difference. So what else is going on here?
And we're not really going to dig too much into this. You can take a look at this once you receive the slides in your email, but we just want to point out that where you live matters. And it's also connected to how much you're expected to earn. So you'll see here, you might notice that the suburbs have a much higher projection than the inner city. So we're going to come around with some packets in person, and that should be put right into the chat for you if you're virtual.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. So normally we would dig through this info and like really get into it, but for the sake of our time today, we're just going to highlight some key information as we walk you through this packet.
And set the stage for where we're trying to go with the history today.
Yes, and as we do that, we want you to think about what story does this tell you about our community and what role do you play in that story? So you might notice here that where you live is also connected to how long you're expected to live. This might be familiar to some of you. And on this information we see right here, a child that is born and raised in the city of Rochester, like myself, is expected to live 13 years less than a child that is born and raised in Pittsburgh. Or even thinking about socioeconomic status, we'll see that racial disparity continues whether a person is low SES or if they're high SES. Or even thinking about the connection between home ownership rates and home value. Or percentage of income paid for rent. And finally, we just want you to think about mental health, access to mental health services, and housing, and how all of that data is connected because we truly see that as being connected.
How does a department like the Department of Psychiatry do this work if we have these issues with housing going on as well, or of insurance access to actually have mental health services?
So I'd like us to consider this quote from Wade Norwood, who's also on our advisory board. The color of your skin or amount of resources in your neighborhood should not determine how long you live. We know how to close these gaps. We can reverse overdoses, we can de-escalate violence, and we can prevent drug addiction, heart disease, and COVID. What we need is continued commitment to public health preventative measures and immediate action to ensure that everyone is able to live a long and healthy life.
So if we really believe that quote from Wade Norwood, if you look at this data that I imagine for most of you is not new, but we think we need to sit with it, we need to be reminded of this data about where we live, what's happening in our community, what we're allowing to occur. If we believe what U of R joined the Black Agenda group in saying after 2020, that racism in our community is a public health crisis, that we really actually, to do healthcare well at the University of Rochester, we have to deal with how racism impacts the social determinants of health. We need to take it seriously and think, what do we have to do differently? And what can we learn from the failures of the past, both here at U of R and in the community? Common Ground Health and Wade Norwood suggest we need to be a part of joining the Commission on Race and Structural Equity, or RAISE. And that right here is something that your former chair, Dr. Kane, was a part of with Mayor Evans and County Executive Bello. They worked with the former Mayor Johnson and many others on this blue ribbon panel to create recommendations for how does Rochester address the problems we just looked at in the data. And one of the number one recommendations, jointly with the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative, is we have to end the current redlining that's occurring. The way redlining in the past has evolved into current economic exclusionary zoning codes that were part of redlining but never made illegal and have very much continued to shape our suburbs. So from a moral and a racial equity standpoint, they are saying this is something we need to do. This is almost identical to something that happened in 1968 that we're going to focus a lot on today in just a minute. The county and city government came together and declared that there was a metropolitan housing crisis, much like people did in 2020 and are talking about right now. They put together a blue ribbon panel of leaders, of the head of Xerox, the CEO of Kodak, and so many others to come together and say, what are we going to do about it? We're going to talk about what they did, which was very similar to today, and look a little bit about what we might learn. But if you're sitting here and you're like, yeah, racial equity is cool, but like, what about like myself? What about the economics? Like, is this just about being a do-gooder? Many of you in this room, there's more to that story. You know that there's a record shortage in housing. If any of you have tried to find an apartment or a home to buy in the last few years, especially those of you who are students in this room, you know it's been a crisis. It's been incredibly challenging. The head of our local real estate board, Jim Yockel, has actually publicly called that towns change their zoning codes to actually lower lot sizes, allow for more affordable housing, townhomes, apartments, saying that what we're doing is actually hurting in a big way Rochester's economic growth, something they said in the 60s. In fact, the head of the real estate board joined Action for a Better Community on their greenlining panel with several local banks who are actually working on addressing the impacts of redlining that they helped create, and saying we need to do this for the moral reason, but just as much for the environment and just as much for the economic health of our community. And just a few key facts really fast about why this is a crisis currently before we take a look at what's going on. When it comes to cost burden, the rates are dramatic in our community. 50% of rentals in the Rochester area are owned by slumlords. When it comes to rising costs and fair market rent, to get a 2-bedroom, it's raised by 26% just over the last 2 years. You have to be making at least $54,000 to have an affordable rent in our community. The median home price has risen by 12% in just the last year or so. When you think of affordable units, those have dramatically decreased. The disparities economically have dramatically increased, and all of this comes from the analysis provided to us by the Empire Justice Center. You can look closer, but what I want to say is there is an undeniable thing happening in our community with housing. There is a lot of work going on to do something about it, but if we don't learn from the past, we're not going to be able to address it. Before we do that, let's check in.
So we just gave you a lot of heavy data, so you really want to check in, see how you're doing. These are called our zones of regulation. We're going to do this non-verbally. So we'll hold up 1 for blue, 2 for green, 3 for yellow, and 4 for red. If you are joining us virtually, feel free to put it in the Q&A. And I know this data for me always puts me in the 3, gets me a little worried, right, about my future. But then I'm also in a 2 right now to be in this space, a little positive outlook for the future by sharing this information with y'all. So I am in 2 zones at once. If you're in person, we ask that you hold up a finger, show which zone that you are in.
I'm like a 2 and a 4.
2 and a 4.
I know for my psychiatry friends, this might feel a little more normal, but at the same time, in my 4th grade class, as adults, we got to check in with each other. Like, how are we doing? Look around the room, give someone a smile if it looks like they need it.
Yes. Thank you for being vulnerable in that moment. And we'd like to read this quote from James Baldwin. The purpose of education is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself, to make his own decisions. Let's recenter ourselves around our inquiry questions for today. How has racism impacted Greater Rochester? How have people responded and resisted? How does this history inform my work at URMC and my participation in my community? And what lessons can we learn from past equity efforts specific to housing and health in Greater Rochester?
Oops.
Thank you. So to have a productive conversation, we have some language that we would like you to consider. This term anti-racist, and when we say anti-racist, we really focus on the individual's beliefs and actions versus the person as a whole. Believing and acting as if racial groups are equals and actively resisting racism. For example, Dr. Levy, Dr. Lunsford, and Senator Schwartzwald, they demonstrated anti-racist actions when they called out the university's racist policies. We will say they were demonstrating anti-racist actions. And our goal today is to lean into how to be anti-racist, how to have more anti-racist actions.
I want to point out that their efforts were successful, but the university met their answer with tokenism. They allowed 1 Black medical student in a year. This really didn't change until around the 1980s when there was a renewed push. And even by 2016, we know only, I think, 84 Black male graduates had graduated from the University of Rochester Medical School. Change is happening, and yet so often we allow letting 1 person in and saying they're the first to be our success. And that's one of the first lessons I think we really need to think about as we look at some of our current efforts. In the past, I've talked with you a little bit about the history of housing segregation in Rochester and the current impacts. You'll see 2 neighborhoods, the 3rd and 7th wards, were the primary areas that were redlined in our community, where African Americans and other non-white folks were forced to live. This didn't change until the late 1960s, but when you look at this map from 2010, looking at today, we know things have not changed almost at all over this period of time. Much of this came from this idea or this economic policy and a national law passed as part of the New Deal called redlining. Just to review with you that may not know, the government gave $119 billion, invested in 35 million families, 98% of whom were white, to be able to purchase and buy homes in yellow, green, and blue neighborhoods and the newly developed and being built suburbs. What we haven't talked as much about in the past is some of the actual language in the law. The government codified and incentivized 2 key things to protect neighborhoods from adverse influences. And as Tay walks us through this, I want to invite you to jot down or think about what words or phrases stick out to you, and how does some of the past still be here in the present in this language.
The need for protection from adverse influences is greater in undeveloped or partially developed areas. High ratings should be given where there are adequate and enforced zoning regulations or effective restrictive covenants for the entire tract, providing protection against undesirable encroachment. Carefully compiled and fully enforced zoning regulations are effective in controlling both the subject property and the surrounding area. However, they are rarely sufficient on their own to ensure a homogeneous and harmonious neighborhood. Recorded restrictive covenants should strengthen and supplement zoning ordinances. To be effective, they should include specific provisions, including the prohibition of occupancy by races other than those intended.
Just think about which words stuck out to you there, right? intended, prohibition, exclusion, protection from adverse influence. Our community responded. They were incentivized to do this, but it took no trouble for every member of our county legislature and city and our towns, a group of white men, to sign on and actually pass into law on county-owned land racial covenants like this one that said no person of any race other than the Caucasian shall use or occupy these loans. Several local banks like Rochester Savings Bank, Eastman Savings and Loan, First Federal, and many others signed on to these whites-only covenants. There are over 10,000 of these across Monroe County. We've talked about this in detail in other presentations, but what we haven't linked to as explicitly is how, along with this, the government said you can't just have whites-only deeds to keep your neighborhoods homogenous. You have to protect through zoning. Every town in Monroe County jumped at this. Penfield and Pittsford zoning boards participating in this idea of NIMBYism, or not behind my house, not in my backyard. Their codes were designed to increase class discrimination by creating larger lot sizes and larger homes, preventing apartments, condos, and duplexes from being built in most of our communities, especially on the east side, and making it almost impossible to build smaller starter homes in any of these communities. If anyone here has looked for a house in the last few years, there's not a home for $125,000 in Rochester suburbs, right? So keeping some of that in mind. This went into effect, and it made it really difficult, even for Black individuals and families that had significant income and wealth, like the Coopers, who in 1954 were confronted by housing segregation, answering ads for 69 apartments and being refused at all of them, despite being able to afford them. Going to almost every bank in town, Rochester Savings, First Federal, Lincoln Alliance, and being told, we have a problem with the color of your skin, we are not allowed to give you a mortgage for your home. So many folks in our community got organized. Just one story of this we've touched on in the past. The Coopers joined the NAACP. They worked with Black, Puerto Rican, and white folks. They got organized, and that led to the integration of the town of Henrietta, making it our most integrated suburb by 1960, with just 11 individual Black people living in that town, right? And the reason they chose Henrietta, the zoning codes weren't in place, and the white folks hadn't put racial covenants on the home, because almost no one lived in Henrietta in this period of time. And today it's one of our most diverse suburbs. Now, Dr. Cooper was a high-class individual. He had his PhD, first Black chemist to graduate from the PhD program here at U of R. His wife, Helen, had her master's. They could afford to live almost anywhere. But a majority of folks of color in our community were forced into those red line neighborhoods, and when it came to getting out, faced incredible boundaries and barriers, not to mention just challenges and disinvestment in the neighborhood. People like Carrie Stevens here in July 1964 put on a street dance to raise funds for a playground for her children and the neighbors to play on off of Nassau Street. That night, the police set dogs on several of the people dancing, and it led to a 3-day uprising, a rebellion across Rochester. You can see some of the photos there. 4 people were killed during the uprising. Police cars were flipped. People in Rochester had like this huge grand awakening of, how did this happen? Almost 800 people were arrested, millions of dollars in property damage occurred. The Black community got incredibly organized after this. Thousands of folks came together at RIT's gymnasium to start a group called Fight. All of their platform is up here, but one of their biggest goals was to address housing, to address job discrimination at Xerox and Kodak, and they took over Kodak's shareholders meetings. They led songs, protests, march. They helped get 600 Black folks jobs at Kodak over a decade of protest. The folks at Kodak, which at this time ran the town. Tens of thousands of people worked there. If you're not from here, Kodak was Rochester, and Xerox was kind of number 2 after them. Instead of listening to the Black leaders, the president of Kodak, Dr. Louis Eilers, said, let's commission a report. He hired, before he was the senator, Daniel Patrick Monahan, to come in with a group of researchers, and they prepared this secret report. Some of you might have seen this in the paper the other day from our friend Justin Murphy, but this report was released just for executives in the Rochester area that really starts to give us a peek into what was going on and the solution this group of leaders tried to do. But Tay's going to walk us through this report real quick here.
You might notice that there is an N-word within this quote. It's not what we would consider the N-word in society, but we're just going to replace it with the word Black. The hatred of whites by blacks is matched by the whites' hatred and fear of the black. The report reads, neither race makes an attempt to control or hide its antipathy. The black resentment focuses on the Eastman Kodak Company as the prime symbol of the ultimate in white power and oppression. The housing shortage is also regarded as oppressive by the people of the Red Line 3rd and 7th wards. This will not be solved by enabling them to earn more money, since middle-income housing also is in very limited supply, and most of it is restricted. Present urban renewal policies seem calculated to maintain and exacerbate the situation, not to relieve it. Efforts and promises by the white community are regarded with suspicion and mistrust, in the belief that they are motivated solely by a desire to keep the blacks quiet and in their place and to maintain the existing distribution of power and wealth.
Let that sink in for a second. Like this report that's going on. So as this report comes to a close, the government, after the assassination of Dr. King, passes the Fair Housing Act. It makes redlining illegal, taking away racial covenants, but does not make illegal the exclusionary zoning that was enforced and codified prior. So this committee gets formed. After this report from Kodak, Joe Wilson, the CEO and president of the Xerox Corporation, joins with the city manager and planner, John Dale, and a group of Rochester leaders. It's kind of interesting to look at who was included on this panel. If you see the faces, where people were from, it's super interesting. You'll notice FIGHT, the civil rights group, was not included in this. Of the leadership, these are their names and where they worked. Those that we bolded were all folks that actively participated, at least to our knowledge, in the redlining practice that created the current situation and the uprising. So it's sort of interesting. These folks come together to solve the problem that they created, but don't acknowledge that they helped create the problem. I think is really interesting and relevant to today. I will note that on this list, the University of Rochester was not included. The president of U of R was Alan Wallace, and they did not participate in any of some of this kind of work. Something to kind of think about. So the committee hired a consulting firm to say, what should we do? And they said the biggest problem right now in your community is there's no housing. If you folks wanted to leave those neighborhoods, they couldn't, because we've made it almost impossible to build homes that people could actually transition into. So for example, in 1950, my grandfather, who's white, moved into a starter home in Greece, the kind of home that was no longer being built after the 1960s. Right? He used that redlining, helped him buy the home, and allowed him to sell it, buy an even bigger home, and generate generational wealth for our family. They're saying we need to have those same pathways today. So what we need to do is advocate for a change in zoning code. So they say, let's do a film. Let's do a high budget film. Let's put it on every channel in Rochester, a giant advertising campaign. Let's put a huge budget into it, all kinds of analysis, all kinds of support to try to change people's mind that there is a housing crisis, much like today, that we have to do something about it, and that you have to own this problem in your town, not just if you live in the city, because it's going to affect all of us for moral reasons and especially for economic reasons. We took a small clip of this film, about 7 or 8 minutes, that we wanted to show for you. And the film really speaks a lot to the attitude and who created it. It's about 10 minutes. While you watch, jot down, what do you notice and wonder? How does this connect to today? What lessons can we learn? And then we have just a few more slides to kind of wrap up what came after and connect to today. But while you watch, notice this was aired at prime time on WXXI, CBS, Channel 8, Channel 13, and it was like a huge to-do in the community of Rochester when this came out. I had no idea about this until a few months ago when we stumbled across it in the Wilson Archives at U of R, and there is so much for us to learn. So take a moment. What do you notice? Who's missing? What questions do you have? Here we go.
As county manager of Monroe County, I feel it is my duty to report that today there exists in metropolitan Rochester and Monroe County a housing shortage of crisis proportions.
As city manager of the city of Rochester, the center of this thriving metropolis, I cannot emphasize too strongly the seriousness of the shortage of housing that threatens not only every individual, but the entire economy of our area.
Wilson, it seems that many people might have the idea that a housing crisis pertains primarily to a group of impoverished people living in ghetto areas, when actually it involves a much larger segment of our overall community.
Everyone in metropolitan Rochester must recognize that they're affected to some degree by this crisis. Of course, the low-income groups are going to bear the greatest load. They're the ones in the greatest difficulty, and the greatest emphasis should be put on alleviating their situation. But the middle-income shortage is just as important for the long-range economic health of this area.
Where'd you like to live?
Out in Brighton someplace.
Why?
Where there's better houses at. There are better houses and you have more freedom and stuff.
Something like this, or someplace. And everybody living here is so nasty, so different things out. It's not decent, period. And I done spent and bought so much of roach and rat powder, and it's a little small can is $1.79. Trying to kill rats and roach. The powders that I have put out here, trying to kill them. What it do? Fatten them.
Why don't you move someplace else? Been looking for
Been
them.
looking for one, can't find that one.
I read from 4 o'clock until about 8 or 9 o'clock. Practically every afternoon. I mean, I even watch the paper for ads. Why do you keep on trying? I got a real someplace and working.
But we afraid of those things.
Yeah, if you just keep going and continue, I don't know what happens. I mean,
you know, that's the way I feel about it. Don't make no difference who help. As long as I have help the way I can live like people. We living like that the rats live now. You understand? We living like rats.
I know of someone who came to visit Rochester some time ago. And he was met by some very important people of Rochester. And they were driving him back to the hotel. And they drove down one of these streets. And the Rochester friend said, "I'm awfully sorry." He said, "I have to drive you through this neighborhood. I want you to know that this is not the best we have in Rochester." Now, why did he want to avoid this neighborhood? What was there? Yes, I'm sure you do. What was there that he didn't want his friend to see?
See how bad the neighborhood look like.
Exactly. Now, listen, and you notice you use the word see, and that's precisely it. Let me tell you something about seeing. We don't want to see certain things. And the moment we see this neighborhood here, and all of these people, sometimes rat-infested homes, we don't want to see it.
We want new homes. That's what we want.
New homes. You want new homes, exactly.
I think that we have to accept housing problem as part of a broad environmental design for this region. Accept the interrelationships that all of the functional aspects of the problem imply, get off the crisis orientation, and be willing to accept some new and innovative approaches to the solution to this problem.
Just what is the Metropolitan Housing Committee, Mr. Wilson, and how is it organized, and primarily what is its function?
The committee was formed by bipartisan action of the county and city legislatures, and we were appointed by both the county and city manager. It's a group of people who are supposed to change, if they can, to some degree, the awareness of the people of metropolitan Rochester to the degree and seriousness of the crisis, and to recommend new approaches to its long-range solution. Attitudes and awareness are the most serious blocks. There are many people and many groups with good ideas to take action, but they are held back by this lack of knowledge and ignorance and lack of broad acceptance of the need for change.
We are not supplying sufficient housing to many people who would like to work in the Rochester metropolitan area. We have found that we are unable at the present time to meet the housing needs of people who would be buying houses in the $16,000 to the $22,000 price range, because we have used that land which has been zoned for this type of housing in the past. We have not replaced the land which should be zoned for moderate income housing. We find today that all of the land which is being provided with the needed facilities for building in the residential areas is being upzoned to higher land lot requirements and higher house size requirements. This makes it impossible to provide the housing which is needed for the people in Rochester in the moderate income range.
I think that the reason for establishing the zoning law should be to create a healthy community, to have one level type social status for a community is really not very healthy.
Well, if Pittsford is taking the lead in providing rezoning regulations, what has been the public response? What have they said to you as supervisor?
There has been principally good, positive reactions to the whole matter.
I noticed that we're right next to St. John Fisher College. Doesn't the creation of a new housing development have a big effect, though, on existing school facilities?
This is important.
Mm-hmm.
We have given a good deal of attention to the statistics of the number of school children that will be introduced by this project, and also studied over the plans that have been developed heretofore by the East Rochester School District, and it would appear that these earlier plans will not have to be changed.
What advantages do you see to the average suburb in doing this rezoning job to permit apartment developments?
Well, one of the outstanding advantages is that the young people of Pittsford and the area, of course, the people will come from all of this area to this project. The young people who are having trouble getting started, they're having trouble finding houses that they can afford, will now have a possibility here.
I suppose that it also can increase the tax base of the town as well.
There will be an excellent tax base.
Will it be a self-supporting type of tax base?
It would certainly appear that way, and more so. I repeat, most important of all is to make people realize that they must get in and work and accept change in housing throughout the whole metropolitan area. I think that people have to recognize that we are one people, and either we make it together or we don't make it at all.
A little considered judgment may be in order, a little searching of the soul, if you will. What we have just seen was not a pretty picture. It was not intended to be. For the truth about our community is like a Monday morning look in the mirror. The image which bounces back is one most of us might prefer to see as something else again. Yet what we have seen is what we are. Tonight, this very night, young children may sleep in cars in Rochester because there is no place else to sleep. An urgently needed engineer or technician may decide not to move to Rochester because there is no place to live. Our land of plenty, the sanctimonious suburbs, are clustered with new housing, but not the kind of middle-income housing which is so desperately needed. We have locked our minds and in most instances closed our suburban doors to the kind of housing this community must have if it is to continue to prosper. I must be frank. Some months ago, when the decision was made to take a long and involved look at housing in Rochester, I was a doubter. I believed there was a home for everyone. I now know this to be untrue. There simply is not. Several 100,000 of you are now watching, enough power to accomplish anything. There is land available, there are laws which can be changed, and there are men who will build the housing. The only roadblock is you and me.
So taking a look at that film, I think a lot sticks out to me personally about like how it didn't work, right? The things didn't change. The same laws in 68 are the same laws in Pittsford, Brighton, and Gates, and Penfield, and Webster. They did a series of print ads in the paper that ran for 100 days. They wrote letters to the editor, Sears, B. Foreman, Star Supermarkets, McCurdy's, Sibley's, the Chamber, all published ads about the need to change our suburban zoning codes. And it didn't change. And the president of Xerox pressured his employees to go to Pittsford town board meetings. And one of the only successes was that because of that activism at the Pittsford town board meeting, the guy Spiegel you saw in the field who was talking about those apartments, they built them. And only because the kids were going to go to East Rochester. And so they were like, we're successful. We did it. But unfortunately, what wasn't successful was a year later, the town of Pittsford readjusted the agreement and made it so it was only middle and upper income folks who could live there. So it actually subverted the thing. So people didn't keep at it, right? You can't just go to one meeting and speak. We got to hold each other accountable in our communities, right? And I think the last lesson to sort of learn from some of this is the two men that really led this, City Planner Dal and Xerox President Joe Wilson, didn't take the moment to take a look at the mirror themselves and start to think about it. What was my role? What was my part? When I started teaching this to fourth graders, I had not thought about my family's role. I had not thought about my role. I never forget a fourth grader saying, well, Mr. Wiegand, did your family benefit from redlining? And that was an uncomfortable moment. I had to say, I don't know. And I called my grandparents. And sure enough, both of them had been able to purchase homes through the FHA loan system that was for only white people. That generated our generational wealth. That's part of my story and part of a lesson I need to learn as I think about how do I interact and participate going forward. John Dale was responsible for displacing 886 families when the inner loop was constructed in the Joseph Baden Ormond area. It was very public. Everyone knew it was him that organized and engineered this plan, going over the heads of Black protest and leadership in the community. And now he's in charge of this committee. There's a reason groups like FIGHT didn't trust this being something that they should be a part of. Or Joe Wilson, who had 2 Black employees at Xerox in 1964 and agreed to a whites-only clause on his home in Brighton at McFarland Farms that said no one other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any of these homes. His name is on an advertisement for the neighborhood that includes the advertisement, a feature of our neighborhood is the sensible restrictions for social character. Like, how do you go from there to advocating for racial justice without the part of truth and reconciliation? Have we done some of that in our community? Florence called Wilson and Dal and the leadership, they called them Southern plantation mentalities that are still existing in our community. Have we learned from some of this? Some of the key lessons that really came up for us as we were looking at this, and then we'll close with some questions, was we can do a big effort. It can have an impact like the film did. It changed minds. There was a shift. Some things got built, but then other folks were able to subvert it because the people that put in the effort didn't follow up. Tokenism is not justice. Just because your department has an equity director or a group like DICE, it is a start, but unless we all support that work, unless we all stand behind a Chanel or whoever it is, where are we going to be? We're not learning from the past. We're not looking always at those root causes, is what the film and some of this stuck out to us. We need to own our own history. We need to see it as beyond ourselves, that our well-being is tied to the entire community. Another observation, everyday people need to show up. They need to keep showing up, whether it's to your equity committee. I remember a full house equity committee at neurology when I was an adjunct there in the beginning. Those numbers started to dwindle. When it's not popular to join, are we still going? Are we holding each other accountable? Are we showing up to a town board meeting in our town? FIGHT was sidelined in '68. Who are we sidelining for our own comfort today? We are who we've been waiting for. We can't wait for martyrs or heroes like a Joe Wilson or a Xerox or a Kodak to step in and save this, or a U of R to save our community from this. We all have to be a part of the problem that we helped create, and we all must participate. And some of that is showing up to something that many of us, including myself, until very recently have not done, which is go to your town board meeting, go to your county legislature meeting, take 1 hour out of every few months to speak for housing justice in your community, for health equity in your community, for climate action in your community. The numbers are clear. We know that there is a problem. The facts are right there on the screen. And in fact, it's not just from a moral or justice cause. The Chamber of Commerce is saying, Bob Duffy, that this is something we need to look at. He's saying right now in meetings, people are being held at their town board, held hostage by 10 people speaking against new housing, when he thinks 10,000 actually want to support it. On that same paddle, Matt Hurlbut at the Greater Rochester Enterprise Institute, talking about the need for zoning change, said we need to show up at these town board meetings. Some of these planning meetings just offer a voice of support. It doesn't need to be a lecture, just a comment that you care and this matters. That's what Benita did in Henrietta. She helped create change in a new apartment complex that came in at Marketplace Mall that had the ability to affect her and her family who are refugees from Nepal. You can do this next week, August 13th. You can call this number and sign up to speak at 6 o'clock. I didn't want to do it. I don't like doing things like that, but I called, I'm registered, and I hope to see many of you there. I know Amanda's going to share these out in the email after. Feel free to take a quick picture. If you live in the town of Gates, there is a forum today at 6 o'clock at Gates Presbyterian Church on literally this issue because the town is saying, nope, we're not going to allow this apartment complex to go in that they'd originally approved, and now they're taking it away. Where do we stand on these issues? If we care about racial health, or if we care about equity, what are we going to do? How about our equity and anti-racism plan here at U of R? On the website, it says it's all in progress. But what's been completed? Do you know? Are we holding this group accountable? Each of you have power to be a part of that. In 2021, I put up this image of the 2021 leadership. I did not do the work to see what's changed. I want to ask you, do you know what's changed? When it comes to your chairs and chiefs, have things changed in terms of diversity and representation? Is this something that matters to you? Is this part of the equity plan and something you want to be a part of saying, hey, maybe there is growth that needs to be done? I'm not here to tell you what to do with this. Tay and I are not here to do that. Instead is to say, will we look at our past? Will we learn from it? And will we get involved in a different way? Last one, this is a personal pet peeve. On the About U of R page, the history section talks about eugenicist George Whipple, but does not include his eugenics or enforcement of the whites-only segregationist policies here at U of R. We need to start by owning some of these stories and not just in some of our different silos.
So we'd like to close out on a moment of hope with this quote from Kamala Harris. Even in dark times, we not only dream, we do. We not only see what has been, we see what can be. We shoot for the moon, and then we plant our flag on it. We are bold, fearless, and ambitious. We are undaunted in our belief that we shall overcome, that we shall rise up. This is American aspiration. So we want you to think about what this quote means for you and how you're going to use your feelings to move this work forward so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past where they just talk the talk but didn't walk the walk. So we're asking you to think about one action that you can commit to in this upcoming week, knowing everything that you just learned today.
Pass it over to Chanel for Q&A. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, so let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you both for your research, updated information. Do we have any questions in the auditorium? We do have two folks with microphones, so raise your hand high. And while we're waiting, I have a couple of questions that have come in. Let's see. I am curious about how you arrived at the combination of safer and more inclusive as a descriptor for reckoning with racism.
Racism makes all of us unsafe. It makes all of us less connected. We know and have heard from many employees, from many people in our community who come to U of R that have not felt safe. That, to me, is just the baseline. Can we get to just a place of safety in our community? Daniel Prude was not safe when he was discharged from the University of Rochester Medical Center and was killed by police later that night. What has changed since then? Are we willing to come together to create that kind of safety in our community? And to do that, where we live has to look differently, in our opinion, and will be more inclusive. So that's part of why we chose that title. I bet there's a better one, though. We'd love your suggestion.
Thank you. Someone did ask the question, what can we do to help? But you have given us options, things to do. Show up tonight in Gates and show up soon, I believe, in the city of Rochester. But we will be passing those slides around, I believe.
Perfect. I'd also just say, you all have power in this room and on this Zoom. The position, the power, and the influence that you have at the University of Rochester, your town board member will go out to lunch with you. They will get a coffee with you. You have sway. You're friends with some of these people. Let's use that, right? Let's use that. We have that ability. If this is something important to you, make that choice. I see a question right here.
It's not a question. My name's Maria. I came from the 3rd Ward. I saw you had my pediatrician up here, Dr. Lunsford. He had to go through some changes to
Mm-hmm.
still being a part of the U of R. I'm currently the coordinator for Jefferson Avenue Our Voice organization to wake people up that gentrification has been happening over the last 10, 15 years. Very obvious what's going on. And when people aren't in good health and financially stable, they don't have time. They don't get to see what they need to pay attention to preserve their neighborhood.
Absolutely. Thank you for the work that you're doing on Jefferson Avenue. The university is a part of that gentrification and has the ability to think more deeply about that, and I hope with partners like you to examine it. Lunsford had a petition from over 100 neighbors saying, we don't want you in our neighborhood, stay out, and he refused to leave. Dr. King came and had dinner at that house on Elmwood Avenue, and I just think there is a power in the story of Charles Lunsford. So thank you for bringing that and elevating it. Over here.
I just have a quick comment. I'm Lisa Wright, and I'm a City of Rochester, Flower City, AmeriCorps Public Health member.
Awesome.
Yeah, so my comment is we have to start getting comfortable being uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be uncomfortable, but we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
We got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. I love it. I love it. It was not comfortable for Dr. Lunsford. It was not comfortable for Dr. Cooper. It's not comfortable to speak at a town board meeting in 2024, and yet it's not going to kill us, and it is in fact going to help heal us. That discomfort. I have never enjoyed going to the doctor. It is always uncomfortable, and yet I can see better because of my surgery at U of R a few years ago. You know what I mean? Like, we got to do it. I love it. Thank you.
We have one other question that's come in. What can be done in places that do not have physical space to create affordable housing? For example, Brighton.
Brighton has plenty of space. It is not true that Brighton doesn't have space. There is land in more than one place. There are developments that are ongoing. There is a project in the old, the defunct Psychiatry Center, if you know what I'm talking about. I can never remember the name. That easily can be affordable housing or mixed-use housing in a creative and sustainable way. In fact, I know there are plans around that. You have a chance to speak at your town board meeting about it. The land next to the park on Westfall by Sawgrass, there is absolutely opportunity in that area for some of these things. And then finally, the town of Brighton could vote to adopt an allowance for accessory dwelling units. Any town can do this. In fact, Governor Hochul tried to pass this into law in New York State to incentivize accessory dwelling units. These are small studio or two-bedroom apartments that someone with a big yard, like in Brighton, could turn their garage into. The state of California, Minnesota, other places have incredibly successfully done this. In Seattle, it has helped change the game for them and allowing just places for all kinds of people to be able to stay. They could do that tomorrow. There is absolutely room. There's not as much room as some other towns, but it can be done if the people there are willing to be creative and to put the time in to study it, and lots of people are, and then support the projects like the one I know that's happening in a few of those places when the resistance comes, as the resistance will come. Thank you.
Well, on that note, thank you again for coming and educating us and sharing. I'm looking around to see if there's any other questions before I end, and sharing of your research with us. Shane has been here before, so I would ask folks to go to our website and check out the DICE presentations that he has done in the past. Some of our questions that have come in will be answered with those other presentations.
Perfect.
Thank you. Please join me in giving him another round of applause.
Thank you so much for having me in today.
Pleasure to be here.